What's up, everybody? Today I am having privilege to host legendary Jon Skeet. He's the author of C Sharp in Depth book. I know that you already know about Jon Skeet if you did a little bit search on internet, especially if you tried to find the answers for your questions on Stack Overflow. He is, let's say, Chuck Norris of programming. So I also learned a lot of stuff from Jon Skeet's authors, and I learned a lot about C Sharp programming in his C Sharp in Depth book. And today I'm having privilege to host him. And also, John has a cool blog where he posts articles about his learning, about his programming journey. About specific topics. And also, John is the author at Plural site. He has cool courses, play by play with Scott Allen, and C Sharp design strategies. So, John, thank you very much for having time and participating in our podcast.
My pleasure.
Today, thank you very much. Today, I'm 100% sure that we'll have a cool discussion with you about C Sharp in depth, about your latest projects, about your experience. What did you learn, let's say, last 5, 6 years in your experience? So thank you very much for having time for us today.
No problem. My guess is that we will usually, when I'm in conversation with anyone, we go into all kinds of topics that we hadn't discussed beforehand. So I hope that's okay with everyone too.
Yeah, thank you very much. So that's how I prepared, I guess, really interesting questions for you. And of course, I'll first start from C Sharp in depth. So, John, my first question is about why another C Sharp book? What was your point when writing this book? Because there were a lot of other C Sharp books. So, why you decided to write another one?
So let's start with when I started making that decision, which was back in, I guess it was probably late 2005, early 2006. This is a long time ago.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
there are loads of C Sharp books out now. There were quite a few at the time, but most of them were either beginner oriented and sort of
Mhm.
left things kind of woolly in places, didn't go into much in the way of details, or were completist sort of uh, 1200
Complete
page books that
reference,
are
yeah.
tomes of everything, where I know that if I'd been a reader of those books, I thought, well, two-thirds of this I already know. How can I get to the details of stuff that maybe I wouldn't know otherwise? Um, and my journey for starting to do that coincided with becoming more interested in
Mhm.
the ECMA standard for C Sharp, which back at the time when I started, I think it was still C Sharp 1 and C Sharp 2 was released,
Oh,
was
all right.
standardized during the process. Um, I am now the convener of the ECMA standardization group for C Sharp,
Oh, that's
with a
great.
bunch of it's always a privilege to be in those meetings with much smarter folks than myself, sort of Mads Torgerson, Neil Gafter, Bill Wagner. But there was something about getting into the depths of the specification. And I remember there was something didn't behave as I expected it to, and I researched the standard and thought, I think I found a bug in the standard, or at least
Oh,
it didn't match what the compiler did. And I should say, in the sort of spirit of one of my very recent uh, blog posts, the first thing you should think whenever you think, I found a bug in the standard or I found a bug in the compiler, is to probably think, no, it's almost certainly me. Like it's probably that I'm misreading the standard or misunderstanding my own code or whatever. It's almost never a bug in the compiler or the standard. But in this particular case, I think it was.
oh,
And I got in touch with folks. I was already in touch with a load of smarter folks, and I think I got in touch with John Jagger, who was the convener at the time, um, and he sort of got me into thinking about C Sharp in a more rigorous way. And what I wanted to do in C Sharp in depth was effectively produce a more if I say a more readable version of the standard, that sounds like I'm ragging on the standard and saying that it's just badly written and hard to read. It's not that. It's that specifications and standards are written for a particular audience, um, and have to be absolutely cover every single corner case, usually don't go into best practices or the reason why things are done a particular way. There's all kinds of ways in which they are not designed to be read by most developers. I hope
Definitely.
that now when we're standardizing features that we do make it as readable as we can, but with the right emphasis. So I wanted to do something along the lines of developers would be able to read C# in depth and might then be interested enough. I might spark their interest to go and read the standard if C# in
Mhm.
depth didn't explain something, but it would be much more precise than some of the introductory um, books that sort of hand wave over a bunch of things. Now, I want to be really clear. This is not ragging on those introductory books. I have
Mhm.
attempted to write a C# from the very beginning book. I've tried that a couple of times, and it's one of those things where you really want to be able to write one paragraph that's based on another, but you haven't got to that bit yet. And
Definitely.
if you have no concrete base to stand on, it's really, really hard to get anywhere. So I applaud those who have written books for C# beginners. Maybe I'll try again at some point, but I knew I didn't want to do that. I wanted to write a book that would be interesting to working existing C# developers who either wanted to understand more of the spirit of the language. How can I write C# in the way that the language designers intended?
Okay.
And if there are bits of C# where I've always gone, well, I know that works. I'm not quite sure why. I'll just keep doing it that way. Like, give people the insight into it works this way because, or maybe the language is designed that way. Why have I always been frustrated by XYZ?
Yeah.
Oh, it's because if we did it a different way, it would have caused a different problem, etc. So it was trying to get people. It sounds a bit emotional, and
That's great. Yeah, yeah. That's
but
great explanation.
getting people into the walking alongside C# instead of battling against it, if you see what I mean. So
Definitely.
in a mind meld with C#, as it were.
It's also
So that
feeling
was
C
the
sharp.
spirit that I wanted C# to be in, and the existing editions that I've got um, have all been version based, where it's like here's what's in C#1, and
Mhm.
that was never exhaustive by any means. But here are some aspects of C#1 that you will need to understand in order to do C#2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Um, and the last edition that I've published so far only went as far as C#7, which is by now kind of ancient. Um,
Mhm.
and those were the idea would be, well, I know C# up to say 5. Oh, I can kind of skim over, maybe still read some bits of it, but skim over and pick it up where I don't know, and I'll get the new stuff. Um, that was meant to be an efficient way of learning. Um, I think if I ever get back to writing a new edition of C# in depth, and I would like to at some point, but it's just in case anyone's getting excited, it won't be for any time soon. I can tell you in a little bit. I didn't
Okay.
mention this in our sort of pre-interview, but I can tell you a bit about the book that I do want to write next.
Oh,
Um,
that's great.
uh,
Uh-huh.
but
That's so
I'll,
cool.
I'll come to that in a bit. But if I do a new edition of C# in depth, it won't be able to be by version because by now there are so many versions. I don't know what we're up to, 12 or 13 or whatever. Um, and so many of the later versions, some of the new features are sort of fit and finish on slightly earlier versions because we've got a much faster cadence that was pretty much unlocked by Roslyn. So Roslyn, by being the C# compiler written in C# and really designed for uh, for the team and for Visual Studio, and a different set of design reasons than the previous compiler, I would think.
Yeah.
Um, that has enabled them to experiment with language features much quicker, and then put out previews for people to use and things. So we get yearly new versions of C Sharp. Um, so I don't quite know how I would organize a new edition of C Sharp in depth now, but I think it would be largely around um, almost ignoring things that I did cover in the past, but now I wouldn't write. So anonymous methods, which were sort of a precursor to Lambda expressions, um,
Mhm.
I in C Sharp 2, I probably wouldn't bother writing about those because almost everyone would just use a Lambda expression now.
Definitely.
And I would probably introduce some relatively recent topics like records and record structs very early, um, because it's not that there can be very advanced uses of them, but I think we as C Sharp developers should start to be thinking of them as a tool that we reach for kind of immediately. You want to just have some data and it's always got a similar shape. Like just write a record and a bunch of stuff will just be there for you already, and immutability by default and all kinds of good stuff. Um, and I'm very much I can't use records at the moment in my work. Hope to be able to in a bit. Um, but I've been learning more about not the theory of them, but what they feel like to work with in practice,
Oh, that's
in some
great.
of my hobby projects, and
Mhm.
uh, where there are downsides about them, and all kinds of uh, interesting things. So I think a new edition of C Sharp in depth would very much be a snapshot of here are, I think, the most useful tools within the C Sharp toolbox at the time of writing. And here are some sharp corners. Here's still, what goes on under the surface. Because it's fine to sort of know, well, here's how I can use records, but the the kind of reader that I expect to have for C Sharp in depth is immediately going to say, yeah, that's all very well, but what's going on under the hood? Like, how are these implemented? Because I know that the CLR doesn't have any notion of a record. So are you generating a struct or a class, or what's happening and what
Behind the
happens when I've got
scenes, yeah.
inheritance? All kinds of stuff like that. Yeah.
No, that's great. That's great. So for the next versions, we should wait, not C sharp version based book.
Yeah.
So it should be some sort of feeling the exact instruments which we are going to use in daily basis practice. Let's say like this, yeah.
Yeah. I think I would probably the thing I always find trickiest about writing and frankly coding is the structural side. I had a particular way of doing C sharp in depth before. I know that wouldn't work now. What is the organizational theme
Mhm,
of this? It could be types and then executable code as two
mhm.
really quite separate things that you think about designing and whatever. Um, but yeah, that's a problem for John a few years in the future. I don't expect to even start such a book for. I would be surprised if it were in the next 5 years.
Oh,
Yeah,
so any other plans to write any other
yeah.
book or?
So there's a book that I have been wanting to write. I've been thinking about
Oh,
for at least 6 or 7 years. I've
okay.
made a few attempts and will hopefully find time to get back to it at some point, potentially soon. Um, and I've had a potential collaborator suggest that I think beyond just books. And this is on the theme of diagnostics. And when
Okay.
I talk about diagnostics, I'm thinking troubleshooting. You know, I don't know why my code is behaving the way it is. What do I do next?
That's
Um,
great. Yeah.
and really, I wouldn't even thought about this book if it weren't for Stack Overflow, because the reason I think I am successful on Stack Overflow is, and in various aspects of work and things, is not because I am the world's greatest coder by any means. I'm a competent coder. Writing code I can do reasonably well. I think I have two skills that I'm genuinely good at when it comes to Stack
Okay.
Overflow. One is diagnosing a problem. So taking, here's a large amount of code that doesn't work. How can I find out from this large amount of code what the small amount of code is that doesn't work, and then look at that bit really, really carefully to work out what the actual problem is. And then I think I'm a fairly good communicator, and there, writing C# in depth helped me a lot on that. So I think I can answer people's questions in a way that helps not only them but other people later on.
Yeah,
The,
that's
the
great
two are
points.
quite closely related, and when I ask questions on Stack Overflow, they tend to be answered fairly quickly. Likewise, if I file a bug with someone on GitHub, because I apply the diagnostic process as part of that, by the time I am filing a bug or asking a question, I have a small bit of code that anyone else can try to reproduce this problem, etc. So again, it's about getting the right information from my desk here, where I've got a large application and I know all the context, but you don't care about most of that context. And
Yeah.
it's thinking, which bits of that are actually relevant to you? And maybe I don't get it right to start with, but I can, tweak things as we go. Um, and which bits of the code are definitely relevant to the problem, which have I proved are not relevant, etc. Um, and I want to pass on some of those diagnostic skills to other
Mhm.
developers, because I really think if I can also boost people's communication skills at the same time, literally with fairly simple tips and tricks. Like my biggest tip for Stack Overflow is, when you finished writing your question, read your question, look at the formatted version of it, the preview of it, and ask yourself, try to empty your mind of everything you know and try to read it as if you were going to answer it. Is there anything that is obviously missing
Mhm.
that immediately, if you're reading the question, you're going to ask another question? So if someone says, I've got the code below, but it doesn't compile, there's an error. Well, the first obvious question is, well, what's the error? You can see it, but we can't. It's incredibly valuable information. So just just trying to put yourself in the head of someone who is reading this. Is it presented as well as it can be? I, I'm very fortunate that English is my first language. I don't speak any other
Exactly.
foreign languages. I'm in awe of everyone who's very multilingual, etc. Um, I I'm a junior church or a youth team member at my local church, and we have uh, a girl that comes to some of our meetings who's Ukrainian and speaks 5 languages, and she's 9. It's like, I cannot get over how amazing that is. I just about speak one, and I'm 48
I'm
years.
also speaking 4 languages, by the way.
Right, and that is amazing. And I don't expect everyone to have a level of English that is um, as uh,
Like yours.
yeah. Um, and I was going to say a native speaker, but there are plenty of people who don't know any other languages beyond English who also don't put the time in to express themselves well in the language that they really should
Definitely,
be able to.
definitely.
But things like, bother with punctuation, bother with spelling. Yes, we can read it if you spell everything completely wrongly, but make an effort at least, because if you put in 1 minute, that might save only 20 seconds from each person who's reading it. But if that's 100 people, then the overall time saved is much more than the minute that you put in to,
Exactly.
just
Yeah.
proofread a bit. So anyway, a diagnostic book would be largely on what's the process for doing this. How do you take a large piece of code and work out where the problem is, and ideally solve it yourself? But if you still can't solve it, you're then at the right place to communicate it to someone else. And what are the best practices in that communication? Um, so that's the book in a nutshell. But
Yeah.
the important bit is, it varies. The main target for this would be people in their first, like, either not professional coders at all yet, so either you're just a hobbyist or maybe you're studying computer science or software engineering at university. And this should help you get into good habits for general day-to-day development. But in the first few years, I I'm not looking at an audience who are veterans. And the trouble is, books are really, really useful if they can give concrete examples, particularly for this sort of thing. I can just waffle in the abstract about, well, you take your pile of code and you divide it in half. Well, but what does that look like? So
No.
you really need examples. And this is where um, I will need to find the right publisher, but my intention would be that I would write a book for C Sharp.
Okay.
Um, and that would have bits of C Sharp code and Visual Studio screenshots. And when I'm giving warnings about, well, the debugger can lie to you effectively. It can really mislead you if the value looks like it's exactly zero point 0.2, but really the debugger's hiding the fact that it's 0.2, for example. Things that you need to be aware of when trying to diagnose a problem. I can write that for C Sharp, and that will be relevant to a chunk of readers. I can't write that. I The time was I could have written that about Java, but I've been out of the Java world for a long time now. So I couldn't write that book in Java. What I'm hoping is to A, make the ebook of this
Okay.
freely available.
Oh, really? That's
So
great.
make any publisher say, right, you can print hard copy and hopefully sell it to a load of businesses. I would love it if businesses thought, anytime I hire a junior developer, I will give them the language appropriate version of this book on their desk day one. I, if
Great.
if I could get that, publishers would be happy with that, and I think they wouldn't mind the ebook being freely available. And I would also say I will keep editorial control over the series, but I'm not going to write the whole series. I'll say, I've done the C Sharp version. Who would like to do a Java version? Take as much of the text that I've written as you like, and I would encourage you to take the structure and a lot of the anything that's language agnostic. Take what I've written, tweak it a bit, recast some examples into Java or whatever, and then apply any Java specific bits. So it's
Mhm.
not just changing the examples, but there are going to be Java specific tips and tricks. The easiest way of uh, running code in a debugger, etc., etc. And then have this for Java and Python and Node and Rust and C and Go and everything. Ideally, I would love it if other experts thought that this was such a good idea that there was a competition almost to say, right, who's going to write the best Go diagnostics book, etc. And I would want to read, I've come up with this idea. I would want to retain some editorial control to make sure that these were all well written. I would read every single one of these and no doubt learn a lot about the languages that they're talking about along the way. Um, and I would also, I think, insist that the ebook for the Go version and the ebook for the Java version, etc., they should be free as well. So I want this
Mhm.
to be a real boost to software engineering as a whole industry. Um, and then again, the publisher, whether it's one publisher or a different one per book, these are all business details that I'm not that fussed about. Um, but that's the real idea, because to my mind, being able to take a problem and break it down and work out what I don't know, if you see what I mean. Strip
Okay.
out all the stuff that's irrelevant to the core of the problem. Um, I think if we could level up the software industry in terms of how they did that, Stack Overflow, the company, might hate me for doing that because it could cut the number of questions being asked by 90%. On the other hand, the remaining 10% would potentially be really, really interesting questions. It's like it's behaving the wrong way. I just don't
Mhm.
understand why. And anyone with the right skills, anyone in the area of that question would go, oh, okay, I can see, you've provided a small bit of code because you've cut it down already, and no, I don't know why that is either. And they'd immediately get, oh right, well this is really interesting. If there's something that I'm an expert in and I don't understand how the code behaves, I'm going to go straight onto the keyboard and I'll be fascinated. So that's the vision that I have for. You can tell this really excites me.
Exactly. That's really cool because I have around 10 years of experience as a software development teacher, and I always see that especially beginners really struggle with debugging, diagnostics their problems. And the easy way is to provide the question on Google and ChatGPT or other tools to easily get the answer. But having these skills, this is actually skills, not a technology. This is a really cool skills that will move you forward to seniority, to lead engineer. And that's one of the properties that every software engineer should have, I think.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
yeah,
And it completely, although I'm saying about having different books in different languages, because of the readership, the
okay.
skills that you gain transfer. So if you know how to debug code and cut it down in C sharp, then some of that would change in Go, but an awful lot of the thinking behind it, the well, I'll assume that the problem is in my code somewhere to start with.
Okay.
Let's get rid of half of it. Does it still happen? Can I reproduce it at all to start with, etc., etc. All of that stays across different languages, across different technologies,
Yeah.
um,
The
all kinds of things. So yeah,
Yeah, the exact skills you're trying to provide, I think this is a language agnostic, and you can even cover it in one single book rather than having different versions. This will be just the transforming pseudocode to C sharp to Java. So maybe you can, in abstract manner, describe how to get these skills, but providing example using one general language, most popular one, and use plus one language like C sharp. And in this way, there will not be any need to just copy the idea and provide Python version, F sharp version, because in this case, you will be the one single source of truth. I think
uh,
this is look like having algorithm book because the algorithm itself doesn't depend from the language. They are providing the exact pseudocode that every engineer can understand.
I do agree for algorithms. I would say that again, thinking of someone who's just new to software development
Okay.
and isn't used to, if you provide actual pseudocode, um, that's going to be really hard for someone who's already kind of struggling. They can write some C sharp, but you really don't want to show them any Python. Or if they're a Python developer, you really don't want to show them C sharp because that's going to have half of their brain trying to do a translation of, well, what does this code mean
Mhm.
in a language that I do understand? So my initial attempts were very much at the sort of, oh, I can be language agnostic and maybe give examples in multiple languages. And I thought,
Yeah.
no, I really want to reach people where they are. And there will be some language specific traps. Um, even
Definitely, there
just a
will be
simple bullet
some.
point list of like, here are some things that you might do wrong. And once you know it, you know it. If you don't, or you can waste hours on it. String equality in Java. If you use double equals for string equality, it's only performing a reference identity check, equivalent to object.reference equals in C sharp. And oh, the number of people who, well, I would say almost every Java developer makes that mistake and then has to understand what's going on, and we can try to avoid that. So yeah, I take your point, and for algorithms books, I think it makes a bit more sense because you're already thinking at a slightly higher abstraction.
Yeah, exactly,
I
definitely.
I want to avoid having to
Mhm.
ask readers to go up to that abstraction. I really want to meet people where they are. Um,
In this
and
case, you will focus only a few part of the developers, not the in biggest context, you can focus to almost all developers without language,
right,
concrete using
yes.
language.
So
But in
it,
this
it,
case,
it definitely it
mhm,
definitely limits the audience for any one book. Um, but I think if I could get the scope, and if I write a brilliant book in C sharp, but it's only ever in C sharp, then uh, I think it would be effectively a failure. I really have to get the community on board to
Mhm.
say, this is a good idea. I really want people who are good at Java but don't consider themselves writers to be um, telling their favorite Java authors, hey, please, could you get together with John and write a book like this for Java, please? Um,
That's great. Yeah.
yeah, so that's why it's going to be at least 5 years. I want to do that before any new edition of C Sharp in depth. And you can see now why I'm not even going to be starting C Sharp in depth for at least 5 years.
Yeah.
It's an ambitious
Even
project.
this is, I think, the better idea than focusing C sharp in depth right now.
Yeah, yeah,
That's
absolutely.
completely true. Yeah. So you are going to provide examples only in C sharp in this book, yeah, for diagnostic.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. That's great. For JavaScript, I am here. So we can work on that. Yeah, thank you very much for providing detailed information about the future plans. That's really cool to know about it because I know that it will be really helpful rather than focusing on some syntactical sugars. I don't know that some specific elements of C sharp.
Yeah.
That's really cool. And
And that's beyond C sharp. And just,
definitely, yeah.
if any of your listeners, viewers are thinking, oh, I was really hoping to learn a detail of C sharp from John. Yeah, I might be able to tell you one bit of C sharp syntax that you weren't aware of before. But actually, if I could just persuade you to next time you run into a problem, start writing a log, take it slowly and carefully and try to cut down the size of the problem to
Yeah.
just half of it. Literally today, I've been looking at a project that I've got, which we can talk about in a bit, where I've got a memory leak. It's
Okay.
some code running on a Raspberry Pi, and the idea is it runs 24/7, and it has a very small memory leak. And before I made one change, after like several weeks, it would just stop working. Um, it wouldn't crash well enough to restart. It would just stop working. So my initial response to that has been, well, after 25 hours, it'll just restart itself. Like it just exits and lets the service restart it. Because that's quite a pragmatic approach. But in the last day or two, I've been trying to look at where does this memory leak come from? And I think it's probably a native library somewhere talking MIDI things.
Mhm.
Um, but the program has two separate halves. One half is constantly looking to see whether it can connect to a server, maybe get a new config, maybe get a new version of itself, so it auto updates. So that's one half, and the other half is talking to an audio mixer and maybe some peripherals to
Mhm.
control the audio mixer. So I've done exactly my own, exactly what I'd advise other people to. I edited the code so that it only did the try to talk to a server and look for updates and things. Run that for an hour. Is that leaking? Nope, doesn't look like it. Okay,
Mhm.
so let's disable that part so it doesn't do that part at all and only do the talk to a mixer bit. Well, what happens if we talk to a mixer but don't have any peripherals? And what happens if we have a fake mixer that isn't actually a hardware device at all? It's just an in-memory fake, but we do have peripherals. And so look at the memory for each of those cases, and it now looks like it is the talking to peripherals bit that is the leak. And
That's
I've
great.
literally got a putty window open here with top, and so I can see how much memory is being taken even as we're talking. Um, so yeah, if folks learn or just we haven't got time today to go into all the diagnostic skills, but
Definitely.
if people can take one thing away that is, hey, next time I'm faced with a problem, I will try to really think about it in a methodical way. I will take my time. I will try to cut it down half at a time, reduce, divide and conquer. Um, that's going to be much, much more useful than anything I could tell you about C sharp syntax.
Exactly, exactly. So thank you very much, John, for sharing this information. How about on Stack Overflow, you have answered more than 30,000
Mhm.
questions. So what common problems you see for software developers? You say that, okay, Before asking this question, please do this. What is one single advice from you?
So I would say come up with initially a minimal but complete reproduction of the problem. So this is for Stack Overflow, it's for filing a bug on GitHub, etc., etc. Um, I don't want to see 3 lines of code that were taken from an
Yeah,
application and
it's
refer to
really
variables
difficult.
from elsewhere, etc. I don't want to see a 200-line method or 200-line program that, yes, I can reproduce it, but actually the exception happens on line 3, so most of this never gets executed even. Keep cutting things down until if you cut any more, you can't reproduce the problem. And once you've got to that, then aside from anything else, then take a step back and say, okay, this is now minimal. Am I sure I can't fix this myself? You might well be able to at that point. But that if you've got that, post it and you'll be in a really good position. And
Yeah,
make sure you understand every line, every part of that code. Why you're asking for advice in terms of asking the questions, but
definitely.
one of the things that one of the leading causes of uh, being confused to start with, in my view, is really not understanding the types involved or the data that you are working with. So, as an example, I've seen lots of posts in
Okay.
both Java and .NET, and I'm pretty sure if I were an expert and looking at Python questions and Node questions, they would be there as well. People saying, I want this date I've got a system.date time and it's in this format. I want it in a different format.
Okay.
Like, no, the date time type doesn't have a format. That's like saying I've got an int that's in hex and I want it in decimal. No, an int is just the number. So understanding what is in a type and what isn't in a type is really, really important. And that comes, understanding how floating point types work, both float and double, and also decimal, understanding that those are clearly related, but there's a very significant difference in terms of whether they're representing effectively a binary number and a floating binary point, or a big decimal, integer and a decimal point in there. Um,
Exactly. But nowadays, unfortunately, people are not focusing this stuff, especially if you're talking about the essential stuff like arrays, data types. They are thinking
yeah,
that, okay, there is integer is 4 byte. Okay, I learned integer. Let's move forward. Double. Okay,
right.
this in this way, they are not focusing the exact details of using the simple stuff. This is one of
Yes.
the biggest problems. Yeah.
Yes, I think understanding the core of the language and the platform you're using and trying to really walk before you run. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, I'm a huge fan of console applications. So if I
Me
want to
too.
test a new language feature, unless it is inherently about something about GUIs, for example, I will always start with a console app because particularly with top level statements and global imports, you know, console.writeline hello world is your smallest C sharp program. It's great. So you can experiment with a feature in tiny, tiny amounts of code, and there's so little extra stuff that you need to know about. People um, who are very GUI heavy will say, right, well, I want to experiment with what these 3 lines of code do. So I'll create a new Windows Forms app or a new WPF app, and I'll create a page, and then I'll put a button on the page. And when you click the button, it'll run the 3 lines of code. Like, okay. Or you could have a console application that consists
Yeah.
only of those 3 lines of code.
Removing all other complexities, just focusing to the
Absolutely. And
problem. Yeah.
GUIs have so much complexity. Um, And whenever you start on a new platform, make sure that you can do the basics of that platform. I almost always really go for the .NET new whatever, whether it's Blazor or WPF or whatever, and run that sample, that template project, and make sure that I can log things, make sure that I
Mhm.
can run it in a debugger. So when I'm writing my actual code, when something inevitably goes wrong, I'm not suddenly trying to fight, well, I don't know how to debug this and I don't know what's wrong with my code. If I can limit myself to only one problem at a time, I'm much more likely to make progress.
Definitely, yeah.
So yeah,
So dividing
keeping
and conquering the problem. Yeah,
yeah,
dividing and conquering.
and not just so divide and conquer, not just in terms of when you face a problem, divide and conquering that application, but divide and conquer when it comes to learning things. So try
Yeah.
to learn one thing at a time instead of, okay, well, I'm trying 10 different features. Oh, it doesn't work. I wonder which of those 10 features I've not understood properly. I've no way of knowing.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah. Thank you very much for explanation. So, um, I haven't asked this question yet for other guests. So, what do you think about for the initial language? Is it better to start from C sharp? Or you may say that, okay, there should be some software fundamentals. You should know the memory stuff without C sharp, okay, the general memory stuff, variables, like in a computer science at the university. Do you think that we need it, or right now anyone can start directly from C sharp and move forward?
So I think this is where I go back to. I tried writing a good C sharp book. Um, so the C sharp books that I have seen that teach C sharp from scratch,
Okay.
uh, they do tend to start with GUIs and
Mm,
I said before, I have all respect in the world for someone who can explain the language from scratch at all, um, but they aren't doing it the way I would do it. So
definitely. This is not a good approach. I don't think that. I haven't
yeah,
seen this type of books a lot also. And for me, things should start from the exact console applications rather than
right.
Windows Forms WPF.
And these days it should actually be sort of paradoxically easier and harder because it always used to be the case that okay, well page one start with hello world. Here is the simplest program, and oh, it's got a namespace and a program declaration and a method declaration and like I don't know what any of this means. I'm literally just starting from scratch. Well, now you can just do console.writeline hello world. Unfortunately, um, when you're a couple of days in, you'll go, okay, well, I know about classes. Most of the code I'm writing is in classes and methods and things. So how does this console.writeline hello world that doesn't look like it's in a class and doesn't look like it's in a method?
Definitely.
How
Yeah.
does that work? So yeah, it's tricky stuff. But I think that with the right book behind it, at least, C sharp would be a reasonable first language. I don't have a better suggestion for a first language.
Hmm.
Um, it, in some ways, in some ways, it would be nice if there were languages designed specifically to be here is your first language. But inevitably, someone is going to want to take that and go further. And if you can't use it to write a web application or you can't use it to write a mobile application, people are going to get frustrated. And there are educational languages like I don't know if you've used Scratch, which is it's like putting jigsaw pieces together, and it's all graphical, not in terms of necessarily the program that you build, but in terms of how you look at it. It's not like there's just lines and lines of code. It is a picture of, well, I can see how the code is going to progress because that's how it
Yeah.
looks in the picture. Um, and lots of people do lots of stuff with Scratch. There's a wonderful, wonderful speaker and writer called Felina Hermans who has done a lot of analysis of what people do write in Scratch. She hosted some. She worked for um, youth programs where she would encourage kids to be writing code and help them out. And about half of the programs that she looked at when she did some analysis later weren't interactive at all. People were using Scratch as a programmatic way of doing animation, basically. So
Oh,
they wanted to tell, these were kids, they want to tell stories. A lot of when you see kids playing, there's a childminder who has their home, and therefore the kids there, they're minding literally beyond my shed window. So I overhear quite a lot of the kids play, and so much of it is narrative. It's making up stories. So that's what they bring into Scratch, and their program will be basically, okay, make the girl move over from the left hand side to the right hand side.
Mhm.
Okay, make the girl build a rocket. Make the girl get in the rocket. Make the girl press the button, and the rocket goes to the moon. Yay! Uh, Great.
Yeah,
You're
yeah.
learning all kinds of things about programming and probably loops and all kinds of stuff. Um, but it's probably not what the
Adults, it is not for
I,
adults.
and it's probably not what the authors of Scratch expected people to do. And I think that's great, but I don't think that Scratch is necessarily. Maybe it's a great starting point. It's probably not something I would give an interested 16-year-old. I think
Definitely.
by the time you're comfortable enough with text as a medium of communication, I think it's probably worth getting into relatively traditional things. But maybe there's something sort of Scratch-like for that's a more real um, programming language. Um, sorry, I want to take a step back and say I did not say, or I didn't mean to say, that Scratch isn't a real programming language. There's a lot of gatekeeping and sniffiness around programming languages. Felina makes the same point. Like the most widely used programming tool in the world by orders of magnitude probably is Excel.
Mm.
Um, if you are writing code in Excel that you know effectively takes data from one place to another, does it conditionally,
Calculates, yeah.
this is functional event-based coding. Um, it's programming.
Definitely.
You're expressing logic, and it happens to be in a spreadsheet. So what?
But no one
Um,
thinks that it is programming side. This is just a graphical application and they are doing some sort of graphical operations.
right. So in terms of more traditional text-based languages, um, I think C# is a good starting point. Uh, I think there's always going to be a temptation to run before you can walk. And to some extent, I, I don't want to dull people's enthusiasm. So
Okay.
when I was a kid, I programmed on a ZX Spectrum. That was the computer that we got when I was about 8, I think.
Mm.
And I
Okay.
started programming on it sort of within a few months, certainly. Had very no real idea what programming was. Um, but then we were using BBC Micros at school, and the BBC Micros had something called Logo. I don't know whether you've come across Logo, but
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I've seen
right.
that.
So it's the intention is that there's this robot that you're controlling by saying, right, go forwards 5 units, turn right 90 degrees, go forwards, etc. And this is a robot with a pen, and you get to see the pretty picture that it's
Yeah.
drawn. I have never in my life used Logo in an environment that's got a physical robot. Instead, it is drawing patterns on a screen. But I loved it. But that was on a BBC Micro, and I didn't have Logo on the ZX Spectrum. I'm sure there are implementations. But I stupidly, like, having written code for probably, I I've tried to work out exactly how old I was. I think I was somewhere between 10 and 12.
Okay.
So I can't have been coding for more than about 3 years. But I thought, that's fine. I'm sure I can work out how to write a Logo interpreter. I couldn't have told you that it was called an interpreter or what that even meant. Um, but I did somehow. And adult me would say to child me, no, 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 you really need to make sure you understand the basics of the language first and all kinds of things. By that point, I knew a certain amount of Spectrum Basic, probably very badly, completely self-taught. Um, I was somewhere between 10 and 12, so I didn't know
Okay.
trigonometry. Fortunately, the Spectrum Basic manual had a really good description of trigonometry. So that's how I learned trigonometry, like
Oh,
years
that's
before I
great.
learned it in school.
That's great.
And it was great, and it fired me up. it was one of two or three projects. Yeah, I can remember three projects that I wrote
Hmm.
for fun, like before you know, being a bit older, and doing more things, because I was being paid to, or other hobby code. But when I was still definitely a kid, there were three projects. The other two were games. Um, and without that, I don't know whether I would have been as fired up. So half of me thinks, no, please don't restrict anyone if they want to do something that seems to you to be far beyond their capabilities, then just let them do it. Fine. The other half of me wants to say, no, please encourage them to go one step at a time because it's a much more efficient way of learning and much less frustrating. So I'm really torn on that front. Um, I would say if someone is really enthusiastic, then maybe say, okay, we'll get to that. If we haven't got to that in 2 weeks, then we can get there. You can jump ahead at that point, but please start with a console app. I fear for people who, uh, for example, write C sharp via Maui applications and then are deploying to an iPhone and then trying to get debugging across that whole. I'm astonished it works at all, frankly, always have been back when it was Xamarin, etc., or back before it was Xamarin. Um, it's a marvel and a miracle that it works at all. But there can be many things that go wrong. And if that's your first experience and you're just trying to get a button to count,
Yeah.
then that's going to be so frustrating and you're going to give up in disgust. Um, so maybe what it was with me, I was just really stubborn as well as trying to do something that was effectively beyond my ability at the time. Yeah,
Yeah, and
don't get
that's
me
good
wrong.
experience.
I,
That's really good
I got a
experience.
working logo interpreter, but I would dread to think what the code is like.
That's great. Thank you very much. So, as an author, public speaker, blogger, what do you think which one is difficult? Teaching people from scratch, non-tech people, teach programming, or teach software engineers deep dive topics?
uh, Stuff from scratch any day is harder, um, because you don't know what you can assume. So I ran a 6 week course at my local church, um, mostly for relatively elderly folks, not in terms of programming, just sort of basics of computers
Uh-huh.
and things that we absolutely take for granted. So I would talk about double clicking on something. It's like, what exactly does that mean? What's the difference between double click and a right click? And oh, my sort of base context, you need to really take a step back and say, okay, pretend you haven't been working with computers all the time and that you're completely comfortable with them. Really, really go back. Um, so teaching programming from nothing is really, really hard.
Exactly.
Teaching deep dives, teaching deep dives to an audience that isn't quite ready for it is really difficult because they may well think that they are ready for it. I did a number of talks on async, and I think most of my audiences were absolutely fine. I think there were a few that were having to try to translate what I was saying into concepts that they were more comfortable with instead of me doing that for them because I was pitching too high, probably. And I want to be really, really clear. When you as a trainer, speaker, whatever, if
Yeah,
you are pitching too high to an audience, then that is not their fault because everyone has not understood something in the
definitely.
past. Maybe it's a communication fault in terms of like finding out what the audience knows already, etc., etc. Um, but really, if you are trying to teach someone anything, then it's up to you to work out where they are and pitch things appropriately, because they're it's a difficult thing for you to do as the trainer, whatever teacher.
Yeah.
it's so much harder for the person on the other side who doesn't know what they don't know. Um, so yeah, that puts all the onus on the trainer. And so I, to anyone who's ever been to one of my talks and gone away confused, that's entirely on me, not you, and I'm sorry.
But I think we should take into account a lot of stuff because if you are selecting to participate John Skeet's speech, you should understand that here is a title, here is agenda, so you should be ready. If you're, let's say, a junior engineer with 6 month experience, and he's talking about deep dive async, it means you should at least have, I don't know, 3 years, 5 years of experience. So it is not
Possibly.
completely your fault,
Yeah,
let's
yeah,
say.
I know what you mean. Yes,
Yeah,
there's a certain degree of laying the groundwork and communicating an expectation beforehand. Yeah, and
yeah,
if you do say this is for people who are already very comfortable in C# because we're going to be diving into the IL for whatever reason, and you come and say, well, I've never done any C#, but I know JavaScript. Well,
yeah.
that's great, but
That's
it's
not
not going to help you
relevant.
here.
Yeah, not
Yeah.
relevant. So, John, let's think as a software developers, you are an engineer with deep dive skills, and I'm a software engineer with good search and find skills.
Hmm.
So, what are the difference between us? I can easily implement the things you're implementing, and mostly nowadays we are facing with developers 90% for me, 20% for you. So, which one makes sense?
I think it depends on what you're trying to achieve
Okay.
and uh, what the longevity of the project is going to be. And that will also affect what developers you need in terms of polyglot versus, if you had a choice between two polyglot programmers who both know C# a bit and HTML and JavaScript a bit, or one developer, sorry, or two developers, one of whom knows C# absolutely, top to bottom, and the other knows HTML top to bottom. Well, which of those teams do you put together? Do you hire to write a web application? Well, it's going to depend. It will depend on their communication skills with each other. Um, it will depend on how well they can divide the problem space. Like if it is, well, there's a load of work to do on the back end because it's doing some heavy algorithm stuff, and there's a load of work to do on the front end to present this data really nicely and make it interactive, etc. And the shared bit in between is really easy to specify. You give me this set of parameters, and I will give you back some data in this well-known format.
Yeah.
For that, then surely the team of someone who is an expert at C# and someone who's an expert at HTML and JavaScript is the way forward, and they will almost not need to talk to each other. I mean, don't get me wrong, they will need to talk to each other. They'll all kinds of process things, um, but they may never need to see each other's code. Some
Okay.
other project where it's more, well, we don't really know what this is going to do yet, and there'll be a lot of changes in the API between the back end and the front end. And this is only talking about web as an example,
Okay. Okay. No worries.
but the same kind of things
Yeah.
can occur anywhere. Um, well, in that case, maybe it's going to be much more productive for the team to pair the whole time, and they can both work on the C#, they can both work on the HTML and JavaScript, and like the interface between them in terms of like any APIs can be very fluid and can change over time, lots and lots and lots. Um, they'll do really well on that front. And for the vice versa projects, they may really, if you've got, well, the interface is really clear, but I've got some tough design choices to make,
Yeah.
then the pair of people pairing on C#, but with only a rough idea of C sharp may well struggle, and then they'll struggle again on the JavaScript side when they need to do more advanced stuff there. Whereas they'll work much better in the more
Yeah, yeah,
fluid.
got it.
So I think it will. That was more talking about language diversity than sort of what you were saying about search versus deep dive. But I think it's there are similar concerns. I would, if I take a long time to learn something, but then I know it really well, then that's probably good for a project that you're expecting to last for and need to be maintained for 20 years. Because I can really think about, well, how might this evolve over time? How can I make it so that I can make backward compatible changes, etc., etc.
Okay.
Um, but it might take me a very long time if there are loads of areas that I'm not familiar with. It might take me a long time to research those.
Mhm.
Whereas someone who can get code that mostly works really quickly, well, if there's a project for some web project that is for an event, and after the event, that code can just completely be deleted because it won't be relevant again. Um, and you might need to, I've recently been writing some election software, not for the US presidential election, but for the next UK election. So I've been learning how to draw Sankey diagrams and all kinds of things in JavaScript.
Cool.
Well, if you're the kind of person who can just take that and just get it working in 15 minutes, and maybe it's not the prettiest, maybe you don't actually understand all of it, but you understand enough for it to work for as long as you need it to, then that's going to be fine for that. Um, I'm naturally more of a trying to make sure I really understand every bit of what I'm doing person, um,
Okay. So,
which
is this really important skills to have? For the long-term process, I think having searching and deep dive skills is important. But what we are talking about, the project based. For this project, searching skills may matter. For another project, advanced skills may matter. Yeah.
yeah.
So but for the long term, they both matter.
Yes, I think so. And if you're not good at learning new skills, new areas, not necessarily new languages. I am very much a just C sharp, minimal JavaScript, and I'll muddle along as best I can. Um,
Yeah,
but but being able to take a new library or a new approach to something, you've got to be able to do that. Otherwise, you'll rapidly become obsolete because the industry does not slow down.
definitely. But as a book author, what do you think about learning the language from tutorials rather than reading books? Because nowadays people are watching the Udemy, Plural site. I don't say that they are actually good resources, but should they be the only resource to learn the language, or that it would be better to read first from the book and maybe clarify stuff from the courses or vice versa? What is your opinion about it?
Um, I think different people learn very differently. Uh, One of the things I've always found difficult when writing books is my publishers are always saying there must be more pictures. Please put more pictures in. And I see this in when I'm doing design docs at work and things. I tend to think in text. Other people will learn so much better from diagrams and find text hard. Other people will learn brilliantly from videos. I find it really hard to learn from videos because I I want to be able to skim and then read one bit five different times because that's the really hard bit. I don't find I do a lot of searching for the right bit of the video. Um, Whereas other people clearly liked seeing the code being written in front of them and debugged, etc., etc. And I really don't want to be any kind of gatekeeper on that. What I would say is experiment with different media and find out what works best for you. there is no point in restricting yourself to text if it turns out that you learn brilliantly from videos. Likewise, if you find that actually videos really don't help you much, even if there might be 10 times more videos on the topic that you want to learn about
Exactly. Yeah.
than books or web pages or whatever. But if you find it hard to learn from videos, then put your time into finding a good piece of text to learn from instead. So that's as much about understanding yourself as anything else.
Yeah. That's great, John. Thank you very much. And the one last final question about your pet projects. What do you have learned for the last 7, 8 years from your pet projects?
Mhm.
Could you please provide information about it?
Sure. So thinking about sort of 7 or 8 years ago, I bought a drum kit, an electronic drum kit, and my choice of drum kit was largely based on this looks like it has lots of configuration, and I can imagine literally while I was in the music shop, I was imagining a WPF application with
Mhm.
a tree view of like here are some nodes in a tree and
Uh-huh.
values in the on the right hand pane, and this would be a much better way of configuring the drum kit than using the interface that was there. And sure enough, I spent far more time on my drum kit um learning how to program it than
Uh-huh.
playing the drums, which is possibly sad, but there we go. Um, but so that was a hobby that um, certainly built up my WPF skills, which have been very dormant for a long time, and I'm not a good UI designer
Me too.
by any means. Um, but it was really necessary for what came next, which was COVID striking. So obviously
Uh-huh.
early 2020. And I mentioned the church I belong to before. I'm a Methodist local preacher and on the leadership team of the church and heavily involved in the church. COVID started and we went on Zoom. I
Okay.
did have another project that I won't go into the details of around Zoom. Um, but really early on, I noticed that a load of people were quite happy to worship on Zoom without people who would never have considered it before COVID. Like they would have come in snow, they would have come to the church building in snow and all kinds of things. And if you'd said, you can stay at home, you've just got to use your computer or iPad or whatever, and you
Okay.
could see the church. They'd have gone, no, I can't possibly do that. It's way too complicated. I don't understand the technology. I would hate it anyway, etc. Well, when Zoom was the only thing going, we couldn't meet in person. Everyone suddenly found, okay, it's not as nice as being together in person, but it definitely beats nothing. And when I'd seen what the uptake of that was like, I thought, I will make a pledge to myself and frankly to God that our church, as long as I could enable it, would never be only in person. Because
Okay.
even when COVID, I'm not saying that COVID is over now, but all the restrictions have been lifted.
We still have
So
restriction.
we're able to meet in person, but still there are people who are housebound. There are people who are ill. There are people who are looking after someone who is ill. There are people on holiday. All kinds of reasons why people might, now they know that Zoom is available, might want to be able to worship
Yeah.
on Zoom with the rest of us in the building.
Okay.
So I decided I'd previously been running the AV rotor, so AV audiovisual rotor, and we had a computer to project hymn words, and we had an audio mixer. And the audio mixer had 150 different buttons on, most of which not only did you not need to touch, but you mustn't touch because otherwise you might mess something up. So it was really intimidating. I thought, well, if we're going to have hybrid worship, then I need to add at least one camera into this. And I
Uh-huh.
wanted it to be a pan tilt zoom camera so that we could have people at the lectern, we could have people in the pulpit, etc. I want to be able to control Zoom so that we can have someone doing a reading, or even we've had a minister who wasn't well preaching from home on Zoom, and still the people in the church building can hear, and everyone else on Zoom can hear.
Okay.
So Right. Well, it was intimidating to start with, and now you're adding in cameras and zoom. This is going to be way too hard. So I started looking around for software that would integrate all of these things. I knew it wouldn't work with the mixer that we had that was just an analog mixer, but I knew that digital mixers exist. Surely there's some way of bringing everything together. I had a vision of what I kind of wanted, which is at the touch of a button, I want to change the camera angle or maybe change which camera is being displayed. I want to start displaying the words of the next hymn. I want to mute the preacher's microphone. I want to turn on a microphone that will pick up the congregation singing. And all of those 4 or 5 different things, I don't want to have to go because that's going to be really stressful. And I'm not going to get anyone else to do that at all. It must be press one button, it all happens.
Automatically, yeah.
Surely that's not too much to ask. Yeah, that's something that many, many, many modern churches would find useful.
Okay.
I still haven't seen any off-the-shelf software to do that. So probably foolishly, I decided to start building my own AV system.
Okay.
And that is where I have spent an awful lot of my time over the last 4 years.
Oh, 4 years.
Um,
That's too
and
much.
I'm really proud of what I've accomplished. Currently, it's only still being used in my church. I've got a few other churches interested, but I'm not pushing. They can take a while to evaluate it. Any change to systems, particularly when you've got volunteers who might be resistant to change, they know they know that what they're doing is hard, but at least they know what they're doing. Um, so that's a project that I've learned a lot. I've learned technical things, mostly in terms of integrating with audio mixers. My shed now has more audio mixers than any shed has any right to. Um, and it's got 3 pan tilt zoom cameras, 2 webcams, and it's far makes no sense unless you're doing what I'm doing. Um, so I've learned various technical bits about integration, far more about WPF than I knew about before, but more I've learned about designing a product that, product sounds ever so commercial, but designing an application, a thing that will meet different people's needs, where those people, in my case, I've got the congregation of the church, so they need to be able to see things, and some of the features that I've added have been very much for the congregation. Just recently I added the a last page indicator. It's just a thin white line on the last verse of a hymn that you're projecting or whatever, and then people can see that's the end of the hymn. Other features have been something that the congregation might know nothing about. So I've got you can control this via keyboard and mouse, using a Windows application or using a Stream Deck, where the top row of buttons or the top 2 rows is, well, now it's a hymn, now it's whatever,
Mhm.
and then you can control the hymn words or PowerPoint presentation or whatever it is with the bottom row, and that's purely for the operator. So meeting at least 2 different sets of needs, but it's more than that because I know that I will always know the system better than anyone else will,
Definitely.
and I can run a service with some fancy bits in, so you can control colored lights and all kinds of things in a few cases, but I want to make it possible to give someone who really isn't terribly, and they need to be not terrified of using a computer, but if someone doesn't think of themselves as technical, but they're okay, they can send email, that they know their way around turning a computer on, using a mouse. I want that to be the bar, so as low as possible for if it's a simple service that's just projecting some hymns, projecting
I got it. Yeah.
the preacher with a microphone. So long as it's only that, yep, I can do that. And everything in between, and the setting up the service beforehand versus the actually presenting it, those don't need to be the same person. So it's been all around really knowing. I think for this project more than any other project I've worked on, I have known the requirements really, really well because I've been living the requirements.
Uh-huh.
I've been talking directly to members of the congregation saying, is the text big enough? What can we do? We have a member of our congregation who can't see long distance terribly well. So the application was already running a web server so that you could communicate with a mobile app. Um, but we got a tablet and I put something in the web server so that it would literally just refresh a server provided image, which would be whatever text is being projected. So she can read and sing the hymns from a tablet, and it's showing exactly the same words that are on the screen.
Oh, that's great.
If I hadn't spoken to this person, I wouldn't have known about the need. But they're the congregation that I worship with, that sometimes I preach to, that I'm with all the time. So they feel they can say, well, this is the situation I'm in, and they might suggest a different solution. This person originally said, well, could I use Zoom? I know it's going out on Zoom. Can I join the Zoom service while I'm in the church? I'm thinking, well, things could go wrong there in a number of ways. You could get audio feedback, all kinds of things could go wrong. But now that I understand the problem you're facing, I can try to address it. And likewise, I talk to everyone on the AV rotor and say, have you got any ideas? How can I make this easier? What's tricky, etc. And I'm using it, I'm on the AV rotor as often as anyone else is. So I'm using it all the time. It used to be back when it was under more active development, it's still being new versions all the time. But I used to always have a notepad with me, and after every Sunday morning service, I would have a notebook of, right, I want to implement this feature, tweak that bit, etc., etc. There would always be something more to do. So it's been really, really rewarding in terms of improving my technical skills. It's been great for providing blog posts, giving user group talks, talking on podcasts like
Great.
this. I've been able to take this one project and get so much out of it. And also like the simple joy of, I'm not trying to convert anyone, by the way, in any of this, but being able to combine my faith and my skills is really, really rewarding.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the project that is closest to my heart, let's say.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. One final question about the project. So nowadays, especially software engineers trying to get rid of communication with business people, the requirement stuff, and they are mostly trying to focus only development. I've received user story. Okay, this is my part. I will just read and convert it to the programming language. So what is your advice for software developers in terms of requirements? How much the requirements business matter for software developer? The small answer will be enough, and we can finish
It
our discussion.
matters immensely. The better you can understand your users, the better by any standard. Um, and I would say in many cases you won't know as much of your product managers or business analysts or whatever about your users, and that's fine. That's their job, is to know their users.
Yeah.
Um, but don't just think of it as a transactional, okay, you give me the requirements, I just implement them.
Yeah.
If you haven't got questions about the requirements, then either your business analyst is the best communicator in the world and has anticipated your every question, um, or you're not doing your job. And really, like, even if it's not a question about the requirements themselves, you could absolutely implement this, but you're asking yourself, why would someone want that? It feels like
Yeah.
that's a really odd thing to want. Then ask, because the answer will either be, oh yeah, you've got a good point. Let's tweak this a bit. We can make it a better experience for the users. Or it will be, okay, the thing that you're not currently aware of about our users is that, a third of them are hard of hearing. So that's why we want to show the text as well as saying, making a noise or whatever. And you'll suddenly have more user empathy. And the better, even if there's someone between, I won't say in the way, but between you and the users, well, if they're representing the users, then they should be able to give you some degree of empathy. And the more of that that you can have, not only will you do a better job and you'll end up with a better product, but I think you'll have a greater degree of satisfaction
Definitely.
because I almost no experience I've had in software is has compared with uh, the woman, and there are now actually two women using tablets, and I know one of them was almost on the verge of not coming to the church building to worship. And every time I see her, she's so glad about the relatively small thing I've done. It's so rewarding. And yeah, this is a bit of a strange situation, but if you're working on insurance or whatever business thing it is, if you can be uh, if you can understand your users and know that you are doing something to make their lives better, that's got to be worth something.
Exactly. Definitely. Yeah. That was our last question. John, thank you very much. It was really, really excited to have you today. It was
Thank
really,
you.
really cool discussion with you. Also, I have here another more questions, but I hope for the future,
Yep,
well,
absolutely.
we may have organized another session to deep
Hmm.
dive maybe the software design processes, I don't know, the module design, I don't know, internal design, high level detailed design, etc. So
Sure.
for today, thank you very much, John. It was my pleasure to host you today. And
Thank
thanks
you
a
for
lot
having me.
for, yeah, thanks a lot for spending time with us.